The first phase of the war, though, went well for the Dacians, in that it resulted in something of a stalemate. Once again, a battle was fought at the fortress guarding the pass at Tapi, a hard-fought affair that saw Trajan endure losses far in excess of anything he was expecting. The Romans technically won the battle, but only because the Dacians withdrew from the field after a sudden storm kicked up, rather than because they were beaten militarily. Somewhat shocked at the cost of his Pyrrhic victory, Trajan came down out of the mountains before winter began and withdrew to the Roman side of the Danube to regroup. This was going to be harder than he thought. Still doable, but his men needed to rest and recuperate before they could be expected to finish the job. Over the winter of 101-102, though, the Romans were unexpectedly called back into action. Believing that he had the Romans on the run, Decebalus decided to go on the offensive, and he led his army across the frozen Danube to raid Moesia and further demoralize the battered legions. But Decebalus' offensive got off to a rocky start when cracks in the ice swallowed a portion of his army before they had a chance to inflict any damage on the Romans at all. Now themselves demoralized, the Dacians were easily driven home by the quickly mobilized Roman response. In the spring of 102, Trajan was determined to press all the way to the Dacian capital and remind Decebalus that he was no equal of the Roman Empire. But after the previous winter's folly and the pretty obvious reality that Trajan meant serious business, Decebalus decided to take the wind out of Trajan's invasion by offering his surrender. This year's fighting had only seen a few brief skirmishes, but these were bloody and difficult affairs, and Trajan decided it may be in everyone's best interest for the Romans to accept Decebalus' surrender and renegotiate the terms of the peace. After all, it was not the fact that Dacia remained independent that was the problem. It was the fact that Decebalus had remained hostile after officially accepting an alliance with Rome. So Trajan imposed far harsher terms than Domitian had outlined, ordering Decebalus to cede a portion of his kingdom to Rome, tear down the walls of his various fortresses, and dismantle the defensive war machines that lined the mountain passes. Decebalus made a great show of accepting the terms, and it seemed, at least for the moment, that the Dacian question had been answered. It was enough of an answer for Trajan anyway, that the emperor returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph. But after his experience with Domitian, Decebalus viewed surrendering to the Romans as little more than a way to buy time and possibly scam money and material out of the empire. The Romans had left him alone to siphon funds for a decade before they caught wise to him before, and the Dacian king saw no reason why this latest surrender should be any different. So he once again pledged to fortify the borders of Dacia facing away from the Romans, if Trajan directed appropriate funds his way. Perhaps convinced that the chastised king had learned his lesson, Trajan sent along money and men to help cement the renewed alliance between Rome and Dacia. But the emperor was not totally oblivious to the duplicity of Decebalus, and in the years after his first campaign in Dacia, he had Apollodorus build a permanent bridge across the Danube in case the Romans needed to reinvade. Over 1,100 meters long, 15 meters wide, and 19 meters tall, Trajan's Bridge, as it would come to be known, was one of the most impressive engineering marvels of the ancient world. Guarded on both sides by fortified guardhouses and perched atop 20 stone columns sunk into the riverbed, the bridge would stand as a monument to Roman power for almost 200 years, until the Emperor Aurelian demolished it as he attempted to re-solidify the empire during the dark days of the 3rd century. Trajan no doubt hoped the bridge would help deter some of Decebalus' hostility, in a, we can come at you whenever we want, so why don't you just chill out sort of way. But the Dacian king proved as obstinate as ever, and in 105, Trajan once again was preparing for war. This time, the problem was that Decebalus was inciting local tribes their efforts to undermine the Romans south of the Danube. Fed up completely with the unrepentant king, Trajan readied the legions for a second invasion. This time, he was not aiming for anything less than the complete destruction of Decebalus and the annexation of Dacia into the empire as a conquered province. In the spring of 106, Trajan ordered 3 columns into Dacia to overwhelm the kingdom. The bulk of each of the 3 columns drove from different directions straight at the Dacian capital. but small detachments were fanned out across the country to secure key points and generally smother any resistance that might pop up in the eventually occupied country. Trajan led one of the columns to the capital himself, and once everyone arrived, he ordered a full frontal assault on the city. However, even though Decebalus was facing down the Romans with a skeleton defense force, the Dacians held off the assault, and the Romans were forced to break off the attack. Seeing that brute force would not work, Trajan turned to cunning. Noticing that the capital received all of its clean water from a network of aqueduct pipes, he sent his men around to destroy them all and cut the Dacians off from their water. As soon as the water stopped flowing, it was only a matter of time before the Dacians surrendered, and soon enough, they raised the white flag and allowed the Romans to enter the gates. Decebalus and his family fled before his capital surrendered, but were soon tracked by a Roman cavalry unit and pinned down. Knowing what happened to captured enemies of Rome, especially captured leaders, Decebalus committed suicide rather than fall into Roman hands. His head was delivered to Trajan, and the emperor sent it back to Rome to be put on display. He then ordered the Dacian capital demolished, and a new capital, a Roman provincial capital, built some 40 kilometers away. Dacia was formally annexed by the Romans, and it became the last major province added to the empire. Trajan would of course add much more territory to the empire before his death in 117 AD, but Hadrian would immediately abandon his predecessor's eastern conquest. Dacia, though, would remain the empire until Aurelian abandoned the territory in the 270s AD. The conquest of Dacia was not just a military feather in Trajan's cap. It would also prove to be a huge boon to the Roman economy. Dacia contained some of the best gold mines in the ancient world, and for years, the Romans would be able to rely on the steady stream of precious metal coming in from Dacia to fund all of their dreams. Trajan received a down payment on future riches when a Dacian general betrayed the location of Decebalus's well-stocked treasure house. When the emperor returned to Rome, he carted back with him riches not seen since the day Pompey returned from the east some 170 years before, and in a stroke, the financial problems Nerva had wrestled with were slayed. There was now more than enough money, not only to pay for all previously incurred expenses and promises, but also to fund a whole host of new projects. And with the help of Apollodorus, Trajan would see that the money was put to good use. The most famous product of the Dacian treasure trove was the new forum complex Apollodorus designed and built to help alleviate the burden of Rome's overcrowded public spaces. Built just north of the main forum, the massive new space, which would become known as Trajan's Forum, required the leveling of parts of the Quirinial and Capitoline hills, a huge undertaking in its own right that had been on the imperial to-do list since the days of Augustus. Trajan's new forum would be formally inaugurated in 112 AD, greatly enhancing the day-to-day economic life of Rome. The next year, Apollodorus would complete the most famous part of the most famous product of the Dacian treasure trove, and in 113, Trajan's Column, the triumphal sculpture commemorating Trajan's victory, was unveiled. Rising over 100 feet off the ground, the freestanding column is wrapped 23 times by 600 feet of frieze sculpture, telling the story of Trajan's campaigns. The column stands today in Rome, and in addition to simply being a marvel to behold, it also serves as a living record of Trajan's activities in Dacia. Indeed, much of what we know about these wars, and much of what you have just heard, is directly sourced to the column, with all the attendant caveats about the danger of relying too much on imperial propaganda, which the column most assuredly was. Had he simply stopped there, Dacia conquered, and the infrastructure of the empire receiving a much-needed upgrade, Trajan would already be going down as one of the most successful emperors in history. But he was not done yet. Next week, Trajan will turn his attention to the east, and really flip Augustus's injunction against further expansion on its head. Though in the end his conquest would prove fleeting, Trajan's campaigns in the east would give the Romans one last glorious adventure to cheer on before they settled in to their nice, long, slow decline. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 80, Optimus Trajan. As I said at the end of last week's episode, had Trajan died after his first decade in office, he probably would have been viewed by history as a highly successful emperor. When he took power, the empire was still a bit hungover from the last paranoid days of Domitian, and his predecessor Nerva had done nothing to settle anyone's stomach or cure anyone's headache. But the force of Trajan's personality had calmed a growing political crisis that might have engulfed a lesser man. A weaker emperor might have invited ambitious generals to replay the tragic events that followed the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 68 AD. But Trajan was no weak emperor, and the collapse of the Flavians was not accompanied by a destructive civil war. This feat by itself was an enormous accomplishment that is sometimes overlooked because it revolves around what didn't happen rather than what did happen. It's easy to hold a triumph for conquering Dacia's radical civil war. But of everything Trajan did over the course of his reign, the simple fact of the stability he provided was at least as important as anything else he did, if not more so. When the Julio-Claudians collapsed, there was war. When the Antonines collapsed, there was war. When the Severans collapsed, the empire almost fell apart. But when the Flavians collapsed, there was Trajan, and so there was peace. Trajan is remembered as a martial emperor because he opened his reign with successful campaigns in Dacia and closed his reign with successful campaigns in Mesopotamia. But when you crunch the numbers, he spent the bulk of his time engaged in the mundane toils of civilian administration. Indeed, for 7 undisturbed years after he returned from Dacia, the great general ruled an empire at peace. So what does a vigorous man of action do when there are no wars to fight? Apparently, he does everything in his power to enhance the material lives of the citizens that he rules. Trajan returned from Dacia laden with riches that he aimed to put to good use, and apart from his precious triumphal arches, of which there are more than a handful, he directed all of that money directly into the infrastructure of the empire. I already mentioned the new forum Apollodorus built in Rome, but a new marketplace, creatively called Trajan's Marketplace, was erected in the capital at the same time, as well as an extensive bath complex, creatively called the Baths of Trajan, that covered up the final remains of Nero's Golden Palace. Elsewhere in Italy, Trajan had a new harbor at Ostia built to put an end once and for all to the silting issues that had plagued the port town for generations. He also built a new road from Beneventum to Brundisium to provide an alternative to the winding and heavily trafficked Appian Way. Roads elsewhere in Italy and the provinces were expanded, upgraded, rebuilt, and generally improved, with Apollodorus continuing to litter the European countryside with bridges across previously impassable rivers. There is no doubt that this investment in the roads did much to ensure the longevity of the empire, as both internal communication and the movement of troops sped up considerably. Of course, the Romans' magnificent road networks would eventually contribute to their undoing, as it allowed barbarian hordes to march from the frontiers to the gates of Rome with alarming quickness. But centuries would pass before that unfortunate consequence emerged, so we ought not dwell on it now. Trajan was consumed not only with building projects, but also general administrative duties,